Well, thank you very much, and obviously it's a great pleasure to be here. So, it's always a pleasure and a privilege to speak. And I'm going to start, however, with a brief health warning. And I'm going to make this health warning for two reasons. First, as you will have gathered, today is the publication day of The Look of the Past. And it's been a very long journey. The paperback will cost, in normal, I think you can get a discount, but I'm going to say something relating to Michael, who is my editor, who is here. So the paperback will normally cost $22.99, and it has 90 images, of which 36 are in colour. Now, this is a history book, not an art history book, and I think it's a tribute to CUP and to other institutions in Cambridge that this is possible. I think this is it's a very competitive price, and places like the UL, who offer the most fantastic support when you're doing this kind of project, really make it possible. Now, I say this because actually there are some rather serious issues here for those of us who work with things and who want to publish showing the actual items that we work on. Many scholars bear considerable costs themselves, and I think we need to understand this as an issue about resources and hence about political decision-making. Some institutions, such as museums, feel they have to charge substantial amounts for permissions because they are underfunded. For others, it is quite simply a business. Furthermore, most organisations that sell the rights to reproduce images ask substantially more if it is to be used online. Scholarly communities need to pay attention to this situation and to think about what can be done. And the cost issue is especially striking, as some artists' estates impose strict conditions and high fees, whilst others are incredibly helpful and will give an image for free. Now, I feel it would help if these matters were more openly aired. So I wanted to set this out partly for reasons that I'll say in a minute, but also partly to thank CUP for their support in publishing a history book that had so many images in it. Second, I was asked by CRASSH if they could film this talk. But this raises copyright issues if you are using lots of images. Hence, the images can't be included unless they are out of copyright. So, although I did not write this talk with those limitations in mind, I have most unusually kept the visual materials to a minimum. Now, I regret this, but it seemed a sensible and pragmatic way forward. So the message of this health warning, then, is that we do indeed need to talk about things and the impact of their commodification on research processes. Now, I especially appreciate the invitation to speak here, as I am a great admirer of the Things project. We've had some brilliant papers over the last year, and it's wonderful that the project will continue. So thank you to Simon, as well as the organisers. One of its most valuable aspects for me was being able to hear those who work most closely with collections of things talk about them, not just with knowledge and enthusiasm, but with love. One comment, one comment made by Rosalind Saville, who works on porcelain, was especially memorable. She recalled how she learned about the object she was interested in by carrying out the mundane task of washing them up. I took her point to be about tactility and the need for intimacy. The thought of washing up being an important part of the learning process is rather striking to most academics. So when she made this remark, it conjured up a vivid sense of the need to get physically close to things, to handle them carefully and repeatedly, even lovingly. Yet she did not put into words the exact sensations, the precise kinds of feelings that she experienced in her fingers. Her talk was extremely vivid, I remember, but there we were, sitting in a room, looking at a screen, except for the items she brought with her and which she passed around, encouraging us to to touch them with attention. So she showed that yes, we do need to talk about things, and that there are many ways of doing so, which for her were grounded in her early tactile, that is, non-verbal experiences as a curator. And we can recognize in her eloquence also the challenge of putting feelings and responses into words, which may be understood as akin to the challenge of translation between languages. In any case, translation is a useful metaphor here. Now, my memories of that session allow me to mention another theme, that is, audiences and display, which mutually entail each other. Certainly, images do exist which have not been displayed or have been removed from display. But it seems to me that they are relatively rare among the kinds of things that historians broadly define study, which have frequently been part of many displays successively and thus seen by diverse audiences over their lives. Rosalind Saville brought objects which she displayed to us, but by definition, these were not rare, valuable, or unusually fragile pieces. Forms of display certainly shape researchers' responses, as they self-evidently do those of audiences in general. When teaching, and sometimes when researching, we have no choice but to look at flat images of three-dimensional items. And can I stress that drawings, prints, and paintings are also three-dimensional, even if those dimensions can, or if one of those dimensions can be small. Now, it seems to me that historians of sculpture, and for perfectly obvious reasons, have been particularly attuned to this issue. For example, Katie Scott, in her brilliant essay on Bouchardon's statue, not only illustrates it from 4 angles, so you can see, and these are on facing pages. So she not only illustrates it from 4 angles, but she structures her argument around different vantage points upon the statue itself. Display then becomes integral to her account, which cogently articulates the statue's three-dimensionality. But actually, my reason for raising the theme of display here is a somewhat different one. It's about things and their contexts. To ask the question, what forms of display has object X participated in, is necessarily to think about their contexts, including architectural ones. And these are contexts not just of consumption, but of production and exchange. One of the most pleasurable bits of Look at the Past was trying to research some images of shops to go in it. Now, these contexts are both human and physical. In fact, I have a further reason for pulling out the theme of display at this point, namely to signal that conversation, which I use both literally and metaphorically, flows from displays. Thus, and forgive me for taking so long to get there, talking about things is necessarily closely connected with forms of display. So far, I have been touching on occasions when people have talked and do talk about things. But the title of this conference raises quite another range of issues by using the word need. I can assert with some confidence that the need to talk about things is strong and pervasive. Words about things are nearly as heterogeneous and ubiquitous as things themselves. I can be confident about the centrality of those needs because of the kinds of social and emotional work that things do. Admittedly, some things work harder than others. And perhaps those that work hardest are most in need of retrospective verbal elaboration. The difficulty is not asserting that there is a need to talk about things, but finding the words, registers, tones of voice, genre, and so on in which to do so. But this need existed in the past as much as in the present. So the challenge in the conference's title is as much about probing cascades of texts over several centuries as it is about things themselves. And perhaps the word need can serve to remind us that things can be a troubling category and in a range of ways. And so we come back to the familiar issue of how to manage and put boundaries around a category such as things. Texts too are things, as are the devices used to view visual and material culture: frames, shelves, dressers, walls, stands, albums, and so on. Are there just too many and too diverse things for it to be a useful notion? I realise that there are sophisticated debates about just these questions, and I think they take place more in literary and anthropological settings than in historical ones. And is stuff also a useful concept? And here I am invoking Ludmilla's 2010 book. Now, one thing really struck me about that book. It is composed solely of words, as if the stuffness of stuff had no visual dimension at all. I find this difficult to accept. We care about things and how to talk about them because they are impregnated with meanings. Often the meanings derive from precise visual traits. And even when they do not, a glance can re-engage the viewer with the qualities that allow meanings to flow from any given thing. While I don't think the general proposition about needing to talk about things and the reasons why that is the case are contentious, I do feel the need at this point to explain one assumption I have made in the recent work I've been doing. Most things are designed, even if in a range of ways. So we can plausibly connect their visual properties with the nature of the design process. And by so doing, I suggest, we can seek to work out what kinds of visual attention any given object might invite. In addition, it will have received other kinds of attention over its life history, of course. But the notion of design is nonetheless useful and especially rich, I would argue, in the long 18th century because of the wide engagement with God as designer. I mean to interpret design extremely generously, to include those who cut up prints and paste them on walls or in albums, and those who make objects without a blueprint first, for example. Now, of course, design is a complex and tricky concept, and now is not the occasion to pursue it. But I am struck that when we consider things that are conventionally most closely linked to design in current discourse, furniture, clothes, shoes, handbags, and so on, scholars more often than not work on one such category. Those who write about furniture rarely think about fans or jewellery, for example. So one further advantage, or one strong advantage, of speaking about things, then, must be the possibility of lumping rather than splitting, even if it then produces the surfeit that I mentioned a few moments ago. Now, this project is concerned with the long 18th century, so restrictions by period may help a bit. At least we don't have to think about what strike me as important and fascinating categories of things, such as those made of plastic, artificial fibres, photographs, and so on. But is restriction by period enough? Do things in the long 18th century share any significant characteristics? And do these change over the period? And by extension, are there characteristic ways of talking about things, and do they change? These are massive questions, but posing them is nonetheless useful. If we set ourselves the intellectual challenge of asking about the sorts of plausible answers such questions invite, we are led, I think, in a number of directions. These involve, for example, changes in the manner and contexts in which items were made, the ways in which they were traded, given, and generally integrated into forms of exchange, the materials available and the ways in which they were valued, the volume of things circulating, and the genre and conventions in which they existed. At every turn, things were being talked about, and in a variety of ways, from lists and account books to newspaper articles, from books and magazines to journals and diaries, from learned societies to shops and so on. And many things were specifically designed to prompt and facilitate conversation. So I have argued, for instance, that the relationships between portraits and conversation were especially close in this period. Now, one point of setting out such a list, at least for me, is to identify potential scholarly alliances, especially with those who work in museums. If we are interested, for example, in the nature of paint, its composition and its marketing, the chances are that collaborations with conservation specialists and with architectural historians will be vital. And there is perhaps room for more of the technical work done in these areas to be brought into general historical research. In addition, there are many established stories that we tell about both things and talk about things over the long 18th century. In the areas I work in, the growth of print culture and the interest in spectatorship, especially in urban settings, is an important example. And although their work is very different, the work of Diana Donald and of Mark Hallett might be useful examples here. Another familiar narrative concerns the development of art criticism, which many scholars associate with 18th century Britain and France, and more specifically with the exhibitions in the Royal Academy in London and with the Paris Salon. David Solkin has also pointed out the importance of the London Foundling Hospital as an early venue for visual display. And this too is part of an established story about public exhibitions of art and the forms of spectatorship and polite sociability that they imply, and about the history of museums and galleries, for which the long 18th century is deemed a particularly significant period. I mention these three examples because they are ones where things and talk about things are manifestly intimate. And I like to stay with the Foundling Hospital, founded in 1741, for a moment, because it speaks to many aspects of the Things project and to the theme of this conference in particular. And it does so in a range of ways. I shall come in a moment to the areas that John Stiles discussed in his wonderful talk about the textile collections here earlier in the year in the Things series. But first, I want to suggest some of the ways in which we might use the Foundling Hospital to think about things and how they were talked about in the long 18th century. So this is one possible place to start. Now, it's well known that paintings were displayed at the Foundling Hospital, hence Solkin's interest. So this is Hogarth's portrait of Captain Coram from 1740. And within a few years, it was joined by this, which is Richard Mead's portrait done by the Scottish artist to whom he was close, Alan Ramsay, in 1747. I think it's worth keeping alive a sense of how extraordinary these pictures are as things, given their vast size, their similarity to state portraits, and also of their capacity to provoke comment. it is plausible to understand not only Hogarth's work as extremely provocative, with its combination of grandeur and physical detail, ruddy cheeks and veined hands, but Ramsay's portrait of Mead as specifically designed to invite commentary about his artistry compared to Hogarth's, and as it happens, Rubens as well, since this work was inspired by a portrait owned by Mead by Rubens. Now these two pictures were originally hung, as they are now, in a manner that forces viewers to compare the two. These huge canvases of men who were neither royal nor noble, literally speaking, were, we might say, significant cultural interventions, and they became more so, obviously, through derivative prints. They were absolutely of their moment. But we also know that details of the building, carving and plasterwork, for example, were produced with considerable care to express in tangible form the key themes of the Foundling Hospital project. Do they count as things? Well, I think they must. We might say then that the Foundling Hospital, itself a controversial undertaking, was an elaborate assemblage of meaningful things. It became one of the sights of London, and hence its inmates were also part of the spectacle. It is well known that members of the public attended services in the chapels of philanthropic organisations such as the Magdalen Hospital and the Foundling Hospital, which leads us to think about how people are treated as displayed things and then talked about. Foundlings were literally objects of charity. The prints of the Foundling Hospital and early maps reinforced the idea that the institutions and the inmates could be treated as displayed objects. Now, I realise that the intention of the Things project is to focus on inanimate objects, but it does seem to me at least worth considering whether it helps us to think about categories of persons in the period too, and how they could be spoken about as if they were things, at least in some respect. And of course, children are a particularly poignant and complex example of the point, since they were simultaneously sentimentalized, but also discarded, inspected, molded, and treated as an economic resource. Now, there are many other kinds of things to consider in relation to the Foundling Hospital, and in this context, I am most interested in the remnants, the pieces of fabric that John discussed and which were the subject of his Threads of Feeling exhibition, which is still available as an online display, and the other kinds of tokens left with abandoned babies at the London Foundling Hospital in the hope that they might help mothers be reunited with their offspring. These were themselves displayed things, and their first audience was those who worked at the Foundling Hospital. Some had notes attached to them, or were embroidered. One had a baby's name written on a ribbon, for example, another a quotation from Psalms. These things are fully recorded in the hospital's register, and it is tempting to imagine staff commenting on the tokens, which are extraordinarily diverse. I've long been struck by Foundling tokens as things that invite, even demand, speech. In effect, this brings us back to the nature of display, since in the museum, as it is currently laid out, the tokens are presented in such a way as to both prompt and defy words. The hospital is not, as you know, in its original building or location, although original panelling and so on has been installed in the current site. This fact does not diminish its emotional power, which is unmistakable, especially the tokens in all their heterogeneity, their simplicity, their small size, their pathos. Now, I'd like to hold these thoughts for a moment in order to consider the title of the conference, with its reference to an extraordinarily harrowing novel which hinges, it seems to me, on how terrible suffering is articulated, on the need to recount, to voice what is most awful. Now, I have read the novel, but I have not seen the film. But in reading the novel, one of the things that struck me most was its exploration of the ambivalence many women feel about their children, but will not, cannot, do not conventionally articulate. Of course, the talking in epistolary form in the novel serves a need for the mother who struggles in every way imaginable. It is the device that allowed the writer to unfurl the story quite gradually. In what ways, we might ask, are there parallels between a child who is close to incomprehensible and things in the long 18th century? So now we can go back to the tokens. I think there are parallels in this case, and that they exist at two levels, or rather in two time zones. To give a child and or the institution a token was to express a sentiment or range of feelings. It was a way of speaking about otherwise unarticulated thoughts. Now, these thoughts are likely to have possessed degrees of ambivalence, love and despair occasioned by the object of that love, for example. Rather like the young killer's mother in the novel, in fact. So we need to be able to speak about these complexities, since they are alive in us and triggered by old things. When I take students to visit the Foundling Hospital, they are most moved and engaged by the tokens. We can stand before them and speak even if the words seem inadequate to the phenomena they are meant to translate. We fantasize, we project, we speculate, we identify. We may well feel horror too. So the acts of choosing and giving the token and the processes whereby they were recorded, used, and are displayed are prompts to talking about things where we understand quite clearly that the things are standing in for incredibly complex situations. Or let me put the same point differently. If we believe that things were important in the long 18th century, it must mean that successive layers of talk are somehow involved. By the same token, things often operate where words fear to go. I think the Foundling Hospital tokens illustrate that point perfectly. And this is an area, by the way, that I think we have an extraordinary way into thanks to the Old Bailey Session Papers project. So here are the links that lead me from things to a law court. The raison d'etre of the Foundling Hospital was the prevention of unnecessary infant death. Of course, a baby could die from neglect, disease, malnourishment, and so on, but it could also be killed. The unnecessary loss of young life seems to me to be one of the leading themes of much 18th century writing, policy making, and intervention. So the tokens were one way of dealing with the magnitude of giving up a child in a situation where infanticide was, if not exactly common, at least a real presence. And we should remember too that the mortality rates of foundlings were high. When women were tried for infanticide, the very legal process forced people to articulate what would otherwise be left unsaid. And perhaps babies themselves were, in some sense, things. This is, after all, the period when what we recognize as demography was developing. Babies, like adults, were units of calculation. Of course, the Old Bailey session papers show all sorts of other situations in which people were forced to articulate what things meant to them, how and why, as we see from Amanda Vickery's use of material on locks and keys derived from legal processes. So far, I have suggested the following points. Things and talk about things were and are ubiquitous and diverse. Both also inhabit a range of genre, techniques, and materials, and this may be a way into changes over the long 18th century. There are established stories about these matters which bear revisiting. Moments of crisis, such as those around the Foundling Hospital, bring them, that is, both objects and talk about objects, into sharper relief. And all this occurs within the ever-changing contexts of display. So in effect, we are acknowledging that things and talking about things are both ordinary, quotidian, even unremarkable, and that there are places where the needs are intensified, come to the surface, where there are, if you like, verbal eruptions. And perhaps the most powerful historical accounts are able to engage with both, not least because, as we saw in the case of the tokens, ordinary objects may perform extraordinary cultural and emotional labour. So I think we are grappling with a range of difficult issues when we evoke the idea of needing to talk about things in a given historical period. One is the very definition of a thing, then and in later periods. Another is what I find it helpful to think of as the translation problem, which concerns the turning of visual and tactile experiences into words. Yet another is the ways in which things stand for what cannot or barely be said, or at least only in part, in a highly mediated fashion. I am not claiming that these are the only issues, just that when we introduce the word need, it appears to bring them to the fore. Now, in concluding, I'd like to mention two further thoughts which the title of this conference prompts. First, there is another way of interpreting the title. We need to talk about things because without such talk, our engagement with the past is incomplete, impoverished. I firmly believe this, and I came to this view when working on gender, children, and the family in the 18th century. But this does not, of course, mean that accounts that do use visual and material culture will necessarily be more compelling, convincing, subtle, and sophisticated, but including them offers that possibility. So, for example, a thorough study of images of children over the long 18th century certainly complicates facile periodizations that rely on the publication of Rousseau's Émile in 1762. And similar points apply to toys and games, assuming that they are analysed in detail. It is not the mere fact of accoutrements for children growing in volume, but their precise visual and material attributes. The point, however, is a general one, which I interpret in terms of the value of integrative approaches to history, which in turn implies the kinds of collaborations between curators and academics that the Things seminar series has promoted. The value of talking about things might be extended to the ways they are sorted and classified then and now. The division into types and the history of that division, especially in the case of the so-called decorative arts, especially invites our consideration. And it should be a source of regret to us that numismatics, which is integral to so much medieval history, is not treated in the same way by many historians of the 18th century, the long 18th century. Second, we need to talk about the presentation of 18th century things in our own times and places. And I'm thinking particularly of panels and labels when they are put on display, and the role of captions in publications. These are not trivial matters, because they constitute bridges between authors or curators and their audiences, and also between audiences and the people and settings in which things were conceived, made, and used. These verbal presentations of 18th century things hinge on the arts of description, that is, on how visual and tactile attention may be rendered vividly verbal. And we certainly need to talk about that as fundamental to the craft of working with objects and images. I like to think that by engaging more with artisanal cultures in the past, we may generate an enhanced sense of ourselves as a certain sort of artisan, one who works above all with words. Thus, there are indeed many reasons why we need to talk about things, and I would like to thank the organisers of things for showing the way, and CRASSH for supporting them. Thank you.